All right, I am here with none other than my friend and colleague and fellow minister, Michael Waldrop, who is the student minister at the Round Rock Church of Christ in Round Rock, Texas, which is just outside of Austin.
Yep.
Correct. Is there like animosity between Round Rock and Austin?
Not as much as there is between like Austin Round Rock area and Dallas. At least that's what I've been told. I don't feel any of that yet, but maybe I'll be more perceptive.
One day you'll hate Dallas, though. That's good.
I guess so.
Okay, I can appreciate that. So Michael is not just a friend. Michael is one of the two best men in my wedding. He is I've been a mentor to me for a super long time. Michael put up with me when I was a teenager through my really angsty college, like young college age phase, which was really interesting. Put up with me through that and walked with me through my dad's death. He was actually the intern at the Auburn campus ministry when my dad died, and walked with me through that. So I've been through a lot with Michael. And so it's because of that I'm really excited to kind of introduce him to y'all. And I just sounded really Southern there, as I said, y'all. So
it's a good thing.
Introduce him.
Y'all.
I do live in Mississippi now. And yeah, I am genuinely excited to introduce Michael to y'all, and I am excited for him to impart some wisdom into your life, just as he's imparted wisdom into my life. Michael doesn't like it when I talk well about him because Michael does not want to be tempted towards pride, but I cannot help it. I must speak truth when I know it. So that is Michael. Ma'am, do you want to introduce yourself in any way, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add that, I've been here at Round Rock for, I guess, getting close to 9 months. It's been a good experience so far, and I'm very appreciative of Ben asking me to do this. As Ben said, we've known each other for a very long time, and I have put up with Ben, but Ben has put up with me. We studied abroad in Spain, and Ben can tell you stories about that some other time. Ask him about shoe boxing. That's the best thing. Anyway. And I will also just add that I am single, and so I think I
don't even think I've introduced the topic, but yes, we are talking about singleness.
We were talking about singleness, yes, and I'm single, so I think I can hopefully at least maybe provide a different perspective, or just a single person's perspective, and I'm really appreciative of Ben having me on just for that reason, and I might speak to that more later. But yeah, I believe. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So in a second, I do want Michael to read 1 Corinthians 7:7-9 for us, but just to kind of premise this conversation. And Michael and I were kind of in a conversation before this, but we are both kind of the conviction that if we were to kind of just take a blanket statement about the American church today, the American church has probably not done the best job at talking about and spiritually forming us around the topic of singleness. You have marriage and family counseling, you have kind of marriage seminars, and you have things for kids and all these things. And those things are great. I don't think either of us would say that those things need to stop or are bad, but there is kind of this gap in terms of the church and its ability and our capacity as Christians to talk about singleness and to prepare people for that part of their life, or maybe their whole life in singleness. And so we just think it's a really important topic to be talking about. So Michael, do you have anything else you want to say about that? You can say that.
Well, just that, and I'm sure some of those things will come up more as we talk, but somewhat this has been true in my experience, but especially talking to other single people that I know, just again and again, I've heard single friends of mine who are Christians say that they just feel like the church doesn't know what to do with them, and that they just feel excluded, and not always on purpose, but just because churches are like, oh, you're like 25 and single, like, we don't know. But it's only going to increasingly be an issue of importance because, just culturally, and this is true of Christians too, people get married later and later. And so there are going to be more and more people who are single longer. So anyway, I think it's an important topic for us to consider now and later.
And so why don't you start us off by reading 1 Corinthians 7, 7 through 9, and we'll kind of talk about that to start our conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the reason Ben wants me to read this is just because this is one of those key texts that deals with singleness, and especially some of Paul's thoughts on singleness. So, Ben, is it okay if I read from the NIV?
Yes.
Is that the preference? Okay.
So,
yes. Okay. So 1 Corinthians 7, 7 through 9. Paul writes, "I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Ben, is it okay if I go ahead and read another couple verses from this same chapter that I think help shed light on verses 7 through 9? So I believe, so if you go a little bit further down the passage to verses 32 through 35, let me see. Yes, 32 through 35, Paul also writes, "I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of the world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you might live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord." So I think those two passages are helpful for kind of shedding light on each other. And I think especially that second passage speaks to why Paul says in verse 7, "I wish that all of you were as I am," right? So Paul is single, and it seems like that the reason that he sees that as such a good thing is because his attention is undivided. His attention is solely on being about the Lord's affairs, as he says, being about the mission of God, being about expanding the kingdom, however you want to say it, serving the Lord. And his devotion is completely there. Whereas if he was married, right, like absolutely protecting and providing for and caring for your spouse is something that God wants you to do. However, it limits you in ways. Being married limits you in ways that you can be about mission, right? You just don't have the flexibility that you would otherwise. You don't have. When you are single, you just don't have as many lives to be taken care of whenever you make each decision.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems like that's what Paul's is kind of motivating Paul's language there. So I had an alarm that was going off, but
Michael's a popular a guy, guys. That's what we learned right now. So
no, I'm just an old man. That was my alarm that tells me to go to bed. It's 9:00. So I wish that all of you were as I am, and you would have like your grandparents at 9:00. Let me just make sure that I don't have another alarm that goes off. Anyway, so Ben, do you have any thoughts on what I was saying? Is that
so like one thing that I think is really interesting is Paul's language in 1 Corinthians 7 through 9 is he refers to singleness. I think this is particularly in 9. He refers to singleness as a gift. And in other places, we see him talk about marriage as a gift. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just really important. So like, and one thing I know that Michael and I both of us want y'all to hear us say is that we think that marriage is a gift and we think that singleness is a gift. And to give up one for the other is to accept a gift and in some ways to reject a gift, right? That both have pros that both have desirable qualities, right? So to accept singleness is to receive the gift of singleness, but also to reject the gift of marriage in some ways. I hate to say it that way, but I think y'all can understand what I'm saying. But then also
inevitably,
yeah, and then to receive the gift of marriage is also to reject the certain gifts of singleness. And so we, that both are a gift. And one thing though, I would kind of like for you to parse out for us, Michael, is there's probably different categories of singleness. Now, I think when Paul is talking about singleness here, I think he's talking about long-term singleness, as in like a life committed to singleness. But there's different phases of singleness, right? So like, I guess, could you parse some of that out for us? Like, what are different ways we could conceive of singleness?
Yeah, well, I mean, commonly like the two categories that people end up talking about are singleness as, like you were talking about, like this, not just long-term, but like lifelong commitment to being single, right? Like you have no intention of ever getting married, or singleness as just this kind of period of your life that occurs before you get married, and it could be conceived of as waiting. I'm hesitant to use that word just a little bit, just because I don't want that period to, in any sense, be thought of as like less than. It's like, okay, well, this waiting period is less than the period that of when I get married. But yeah, so anyway, those are two categories that typically come up, is like long-term singleness or singleness just for a period of time.
Both can be a gift, right? I mean, I think we would both kind of land on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think just as there are, as you were talking about, like there's pros and cons between singleness in general and marriage in general. I think there are also pros and cons between singleness as a period of life and singleness as a permanent state of life, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on like if somebody asked you, like, why is singleness a gift? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because it would have to be. I mean, I'd have to like parse out for them. Yes, it's a gift that I've not received. Though, I mean, like, I was single for a good like 20 years of my life, right? So
22.
Right? Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess we were dating though before. I guess.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
I was fully single. I mean, just like full out single for maybe that's the first person I ever dated. Like 20 years of my life, guys. I actually had 1 Corinthians 7 used as a reason not to date me before. That one's really fun.
I was there for that.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't there in that conversation, but
Michael walked me through that time. So, but I would have to say basically this idea that like what Paul's talking about in what you read, the verse that you read that helped us read 7 through 9 in context, that there is this undivided attention, right? So like Mary Beth and I are, no matter what, are always going to make a decision slower than Michael. And it's because there's two people and two wills that are trying to discern together. And that's always going to take longer. Now there's some benefits to that, right? Maybe that's going to contribute wisdom to that. But then also the gift that Michael has currently is that Michael could up and leave, and not that you're looking to leave your job, everyone around Christ, but Michael could up and leave and go to the mission field. And it's not like there's some power in that. There's some, that is a gift as well. And so we're both in a situation of being gifted, and God is gifting us. God's gifting me with a second will to help me discern, but God is also gifting Michael with the freedom to fully devote himself to, the Lord at this time. So that would, I would have to go somewhere down that line, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I think, that's exactly what I would say too. But I would also just add that I think there is, so there's singleness and marriage can be a gift just purely in the mission of God, but I think it can also be a gift just in enjoying the good life that God gives us, right? So, and I was going to touch on this later, and we might come back to it, but I think it might be shocking to some single people to realize, or at least recognize, it's like, all married people aren't happy. Like there are some married people who would really love to be single.
Yep.
right? And there's absolutely. So while one of the gifts of marriage is this regular companionship, one of the gifts of singleness is that you don't always have someone around you, which for some of those of you who are like introverts and all, you're like, you just really like your space. And, some days that can be a pro and some days that can be a con, but I guess just there are just, I think, a number of ways in which singleness can be a gift and marriage can be a gift. One other thing I'll just add in there, hopefully quickly, is that I think in both cases, I'm pretty sure we've talked about this, like marriage and singleness are meant to be sanctifying. That is, that they're meant to be means by which we are transformed more into the likeness of Jesus.
Yeah.
And we can have a posture towards singleness and marriage that completely shuts down that transformation ability. But both of them offer unique opportunities to be formed more into the image of Jesus. So anyway, that's just another thing that came to mind.
And that's I'm super excited that you that's a good segue, because there's some myths that I want Michael and I to break about singleness and marriage, and he just started to do that. And the first is, and we've already hit on this, but singleness, like here, this is a myth. I don't think this is true. Singleness is a lesser state than marriage, right? So like, Michael, how would you respond to that statement? How would you kind of debunk that myth?
I would say, look at Jesus.
Right? I mean,
it's like the most complete human in history is single, right? And it's like, what do you do with that? Paul too, like is one of the most influential followers of Jesus in history, and he's also single, right? So, I don't know how exactly it has crept into our thinking, and I say our because, I'll find myself, there are kind of vestiges of just how I've been trained by our culture to think about single people and married people, and but I think that is exactly it. That like that myth, that statement, singleness is a lesser state than marriage, is something that has crept in from our culture and is not biblical. And anyway, do you have thoughts on that, Ben?
No, I mean that's exactly where you have to go, in my opinion. Is, well, Jesus is the most human that has ever lived, which is something I think we miss theologically quite often. But like, Jesus is the ultimate example of a full human life, right? He's he's 100% God and 100% human, and the fact that he's 100% human is also impressive, in my opinion, because we all live subhuman lives under the curse. Jesus was able to live a 100% human life under the curse, and he did that as a single man.
Absolutely.
So kind of the other end of the spectrum, though, and you'll hear, this is kind of like, I think probably the Catholic mistake, and I don't want to like just kind of like blow back on Catholics or anything, but I think a mistake in Catholic theology is that they would say that singleness is a superior spiritual state to marriage. So Michael, how would you debunk that one?
Yeah.
Putting all the pressure on you to debunk these myths. I just have to come up with them.
Oh, that's fine. That makes it fun. So, I mean, I would have to go to Genesis 2, right? Like, God invents marriage, right? Like, God in Genesis 2, he initiates the idea of Adam, who is presently single, being married to Eve, right? And I just don't. God even says it is not good for man to be alone. And that points to me to the fact that it's like, well, God clearly does not think that singleness is superior to marriage. So that's one of the first things that comes to mind. What about you, Ben? Anything?
Yeah, I'm just going to have to keep copying you. I mean, like, if God institutes the institution of marriage, then obviously God thinks it's not just like passing by. He thinks it's a great thing. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I have to agree with you.
And just kind of one other thing on that. I mean, I believe it's the same passage, or maybe Genesis 1. Anyway, it's Genesis 1 or 2, but I mean, where God says, be fruitful and multiply. And and you see that not just in humans, but in, in all living creatures. Like this, there is something in God that wants life to spread and to flourish. And if everybody's single, that doesn't happen. So
good point there.
Y'all didn't know y'all were getting a biology lesson.
Yeah.
But, there you go.
Insights from Michael Waldrop, everybody. A third myth, and if you have come up with any more myths, and you can make me answer them. But a third myth that I had that I wanted us to debunk is that singleness means loneliness. Now, my assumption is, and this is I'll give just a quick little thought on this. My assumption is that though that is often true, maybe in churches, and this myth needs to be debunked by churches taking action more so than us just being able to explain that away. So I don't know. Do you have kind of thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a great point, that we don't need to miss the fact that the way we as Christians individually, as well as corporately as local congregations, have contributed to singles being lonely. I think it's a fantastic point. But yeah, I mean, I think there are ways that single people can really lean into community, and that if you just sit in your loneliness and you wallow there, then absolutely you can be lonely. Granted, there are plenty of people who are married who are lonely, but yeah, I mean, I just think there are people that I have seen and known, either closer or further apart, that were both single, and I mean, you just saw this like flourishing, joyful life. I mean, I don't know him personally, but Randy Harris is one example that comes to mind, and another kind of author professor that I know of who's a Christian, and she's very adamant that she's like, I'm single and my life is great. And I love that, like, that she's just like not apologizing for it, and it's like, look, I'm happy. And so anyway, I don't know if that speaks to exactly what you were looking for, Ben, but
yeah, no, I mean, that's
I'm happy to talk about a couple of the ways that I think I've seen people lean into that, or into community.
Some practical examples of what that looks like.
Yeah. So, I mean, both in my life and in others' lives, I've just seen like the importance of having intimate community, right? And you can have that intimate community in marriage, but you can also have it when you're single. And one of the most powerful ways that has manifested itself in my life is through what we called at the Auburn Christian Student Center, what we called prayer groups. And I met with a group of guys for like 4 years, very consistently, almost every Friday. We would come together and we would confess sins. We would just talk about struggles. We would talk about good things, and just being there is something extremely comforting, life-giving, and what's the community building about just bearing your soul to people. And boy, you don't feel lonely when you just pull out this like sin that it's just you're so embarrassed of, and then your friend across from you says, yeah, I'm struggling with the same thing, right? I mean, there's
power in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's companionship, right? And so both in undergrad and grad school, I was fortunate to have groups like that, and those are very powerful. And so I would just say, you got to pursue that, though. Like, especially in grad school, I realized, I looked up one day, in fact, a relationship with a girl didn't work out, and I was just like, I felt so lonely. And somewhere in there, I was like, I don't have any like good close guy friends. Like, I need to pursue that. And sure enough, like it was just what the doctor ordered. I don't know if we have time for this, but I did have one other kind of myth. And we've already touched on it a little bit, but I think it's important enough to just touch on it again and kind of clearly state it. But the myth that I came up with is just that just as singleness does not mean loneliness, marriage and dating does not mean contentment. And I did mention this earlier, right? It's like that there are married people who would really like to not be married. And I think in a way that I know it, just remembering that as a single person can be helpful, because there's been times where both consciously and unconsciously, I found myself thinking, gosh, if I could just be married, everything would be okay. But like everything would be cured. All my problems would go away.
Yeah.
And that's just not true.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about actually, and I can't remember which lesson, I think it was one of the previous lessons we've done, is this idea that like marriage is hard work, right? And marriage is like two wills rubbing up against each other. And like we tend to think of marriage as like, and at least all the Disney movies tell us, that it's in the happily ever after stage of life. And actually it's a professor, I've talked to you about this guy, and I've shown this book actually on the screen, the Marriage Idol by Cutter Calloway. And he really did a great job parsing this out, of this idea, like, all of the cultural narratives we have tell us that marriage happens after the struggle, after the epic story. You never see marriage really at the front and center of our fairy tales, because that would imply that marriage actually takes work. It's the reward at the end. And so that you can just kind of autopilot, this idea that you just kind of autopilot through life once you're married in this like content state. I mean, we could ask Mary Beth downstairs. My assumption is that she would say that she doesn't get to live on autopilot because she's chosen to marry me. She certainly has to make adjustments and has to learn how to do different things because she chose to marry me that are frustrating sometimes and difficult, and she would say are worth it, right? But are also challenging. And so,
One other thing I just was going to throw in there too is like, I mean, at the base of this, whether you're married or you're single, I think all of us have to find a way to be joyful and content apart from our spouse or our lack of a spouse, right? It's like we have to be able to be joyful and content and have purpose apart from a spouse, because, well, one, if you're single, that's very obvious. But if you're married, one, you can't make a God. You can't make your spouse God.
And it's not for your spouse to do so.
Absolutely. But then also, so Ben and I actually have a friend who, she just lost her husband. She's 29 years old. Her husband was 30, and he just passed away. And and the reason I bring that up is kind of twofold. One, it's like, well, okay, is joy and contentment impossible for her now? Like, is she just destined to misery? No, I don't think she is. Like, she's a believer, and she, even talking with her a little bit, like, she is determined to find joy and contentment through this process. But I also just bring that up just to say, it's like, nothing is guaranteed, right? Like, and I think that's really important to remember as a single person, because it's like, again, we can just like get it in our heads. It's like, gosh, if I can just get there, if I can just get to my wedding day, then man, I'm golden. It's like, no, every single day, whether you're single or you're married, we make the choice. Am I going to find joy and contentment in God today? Or am I going to let my joy and contentment be based on my circumstances? So anyway.
Dear students of the RFC Campus Ministry, just rewind it a few minutes and listen to that over again. That is wisdom that we all need to hear. And so I just, thank you for sharing that, Michael, because that's just like, if you catch anything from this conversation, catch those past few minutes. That there's just a lot of wisdom there. So we are running a little bit out of time. So let me just ask you a couple questions.
And I can try and be concise.
Yeah, we're not good at that. That's okay.
No, we're not.
What advice would you give to a student considering if God has given them the gift of long-term singleness?
Yeah. So trying to be quick. I mean, the first thing I'll say is I don't exactly know. And I think, at least unless you know something, Ben, I mean, I've never heard someone say it's like, oh, here's the perfect formula. But I mean, for one thing that comes to mind, it's just like you again and again, you go to God in prayer again and again. And it's one of those things that you just work out over time and through prayer, through reading scripture, through getting wise counsel. I think talking to someone who is a Christian, who has been single for a long time, that's great. Unfortunately, there's not too many of those people that we can point to, though I think there's more there than we realize if we stop and think about it. Yeah, and I think it can just change with time. Like, I know some Christian leaders who are open to marriage, and then they just kind of for their whole life, and then they kind of looked up at the end of their life and they're like, oh, I guess I had the gift of singleness. And others, Shane Claiborne comes to mind, who fully intended to be single the rest of his life, and then he got married, and he was like, okay, maybe I guess I was wrong.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah, like it. You may just not know, and that is one of the things of like with marriage, like you make that lifetime commitment, like you don't break it, right?
Yep.
But with singleness, it is like a little bit more harder to discern.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more gray than the marriage of black and white. You make that covenant, you hold the covenant.
Yeah, and in fact, just real quickly, I think that's one of the ways that singleness encourages sanctification, because it requires that just constant reliance on God. I mean, you just have to again and again put yourself at God's feet and say, Lord, what do I do? Lord, what do I do? And that transforms you over time. So.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. So we kind of talked about long-term singleness, but what advice would you give to a student who is single but desires a romantic relationship, especially a student who may be like, second half of college or on the cusp of graduating and is thinking about, moving out and like, oh, I didn't meet my spouse in college. What am I supposed to do? Because that's kind of a narrative we have. You're supposed to meet your spouse in college, and then you get married, and then you have kids a couple of years down the road, and then, blank, 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 So someone who's like not on that trajectory, but desires to be on that trajectory, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can say a number of things very quickly and somewhat concisely. So first thing I want to say is that if that's you, I just want to say that if you're hurting and frustrated or scared, I'm sorry. Like I remember being at our campus ministry building and having that exact thought that Ben just described, and like just feeling almost kind of like this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. So I just want to say I'm sorry. This probably isn't what you expected. And frankly, this is what I didn't expect either. I'm 28 and single. That wasn't in my plan. But that's okay. Second thing I would say is just, I know this is going to sound cliche, but at the end of the day, like we've got to be able to put this in God's hands. And it goes back to what I was saying, right? It's like, we have got to be able to find contentment apart from a romantic relationship. We just got to be able to do that. And I think as part of that, and this might scare the bejeebies, if that's a word, out of some of y'all, and because it kind of scares the bejeebies out of me, but I think we have to come to terms with the possibility that we may never be married, and that is not the end of the world. And I get that, like, some of you might just be like, nope, I can't even think about that. Like, I'm sorry, I just can't watch this video anymore. I have to be married. And the fact is, like, more than likely, most of you who are single and desire to be married, most of you probably are going to get married. But man, how powerful would it be if, like, all of you, and myself included, would be able to respond to that statement, you may never be married, just with like a sense of like, okay, Lord, either way, I'm good, right? Like that would just be beautiful to me. Other quick things I'll say, take a deep breath, if nothing else. Take a deep breath. Be on mission, right? Like, don't let your singleness keep you away from being on mission for God, for being about expanding God's kingdom, right? I mean, first, it's what we signed up for. But second, it's also attractive. Like, what is attractive to godly men? Women who are seeking first God's kingdom and his righteousness. What is attractive to godly women? a godly man who is seeking first God's kingdom and his righteousness, right? So be on mission. Don't be bitter. It's not attractive. I can speak, both seeing that in others and seeing it in myself. Invest in Christian community. I've already talked about this a little bit. Like, one, it helps you not feel lonely. Is God-given way for you not to feel lonely. But two, also another benefit is like, it's how you can meet people. And it's also, I'll just, my next thing is take some form of action. I think, and Ben, cut me off if I'm going too long, but just somewhat like part of my story is like, I think more subconsciously than consciously, I just assumed that God was going to drop someone right in front of me, right? Like, okay, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna be so impressive in like seeking after God that like girls are just gonna like fall over themselves and do, and I won't even have to do anything. Like I won't have to ask anybody out. Like just one day I'll wake up and I'll be married. Yeah, obviously I'm exaggerating. But I guess what I'm saying is like, absolutely God has a part to play in people coming together and getting married. But we do too, right? Like to steal an idea from C.S. Lewis, like C.S. Lewis says, no one says, if God wanted my shoes to be on my feet, well, my shoes would just magically appear on my feet. No, nobody says that. Go put on your shoes, right? So in the same way, I guess what I'm saying is like, take initiative, right? Guys, ask girls on dates. There's so many Christian women in the church who are just like, I just would really love it if a guy would ask me on a date. But girls say yes, right? Like give a guy a chance. Because there's a lot of guys who put themselves out there and then girl doesn't even give them a chance. And then last thing I'll say is just connected to that is just an idea. It's like, and this took a long time for me to feel comfortable with, but like find people you trust and tell them, hey, I give you the right to set me up with somebody, right? And you never know. At the worst, you end up making a new friend. So anyway, that was a lot very quickly, but there are some thoughts on what I might tell somebody who is single but desires to be in a romantic relationship.
First of all, thank you. We probably do have to. I've looked at my watch. That's not there. That's just such an odd feeling. We do probably need to call it. So, Michael, thank you for just talking with me. Hey, that was just fun for me because I love you. But also just for talking to our students at the RFC.